And there's no shortcuts around this stuff. There's no secret. You just need to keep participating in your own creative craft. Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Tara East. I'm a researcher, a writer, a YouTuber, and the author of the mystery novel Every Time He Dies. And in today's video, I'm going to be answering a bunch of different questions. So for a little bit of context, recently I've been going around to a whole bunch of local schools and doing some writing workshops. And at the end of the workshop, I've been asking the students to write some writing related questions. And I thought these were really great, so I was going to film my response to some of them right here. My response to these questions is going to be pretty on the fly, so if you have any responses you would like to add to any of the topics that I cover or any of the advice that I provide, feel free to do so in the comments so that we can all learn from your experience and insights. So the first question is, do you find planning before writing helpful? And if you do, why? So for myself personally, and there is no one way to write, everybody needs to figure out how they write. But for me personally, I do create an outline before I go into my zero draft. And the reason why I do that is it gives me a sense of a safety net. I feel as though I have a bit of an idea, a bit of direction on who these characters are, the premise of the story, where we're generally going. It just prevents me from being super intimidated by the blank page. Now, the thing about outlines is that they're not fixed in stone. You're allowed to change them, especially once you get into the first draft, second, third, fourth draft, all the drafts. You'll tend to get much better ideas once you're really in a story and you're really working with it, compared to when you're really outside of the story and just imagining what it might be or what it might become. So for me personally, my pattern for the last 3 books has been create the outline, more or less discard the outline because it's all just kind of there in your head. You know what I mean? You've worked it out. I go into the zero draft, and then from the zero draft, I recreate an outline, drawing from that zero draft the stuff I really liked and the stuff that really worked. And then I brainstorm the rest of the story. I fill in the gaps, I put in whatever else needs to be in there. And then that outline really guides my first proper draft. And then this is the process that I pretty much do for all subsequent drafts. You're just tweaking the outline or completely overhauling it if you need to, if you realize that the story requires a lot more work. The thing you need to remember here is that there are rules when it comes to writing, but there are also no rules, and you are completely in control of this story, and you are completely in control of your outline. So you can change it whenever you want, and you can use it whenever you want, when it's actually going to be useful to you. When and how you'll let inspiration and your intuition lead the story, because working the way you naturally want to work is going to make writing so much more fun and so much more enjoyable than approaching writing as if there was only one single way and as if there was only one single process that worked for everybody. This same person also asked where I'm from, and I do get a few comments like that sometimes here on the channel. So I'm Australian, even though I sound kind of Canadian or kind of American, but I'm Australian and I just have a weird accent, so feel free to do with that what you will. Now, the next person asked, what do you do if you struggle to be creative? Now, the thing about being a creative person is that so much of this process is about your own personal psychology. So what actually makes you feel inspired? What would make you feel inspired to write? Sometimes, like, I'm a huge fan of Amy McNee, and she talks a lot about the importance of art and the importance of storytelling and how desperately the world needs our art. So sometimes if I'm feeling a bit flat, I might go and listen to one of her podcast interviews or watch one of her reels on Instagram where she's giving a little writerly pep talk. And that will be enough to sort of like reinvigorate me or re-inspire me. Sometimes it's reading a passage from a writing book, a craft book that I really love. Now, if you've watched my channel for a while now, first of all, thank you. Secondly, you're probably gonna know a lot of these books already, but Writing Down the Bones by Natalie Goldberg, this book is nothing but solid inspiration for like 180 pages. Another one that I absolutely adore is Journal of a Solitude by May Sarton. As you can see, bit of a fave. Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott. Of course, everybody's favorite, On Writing by Stephen King. I mean, just about any passage in here is going to make you want to write. And then, if anybody knows how to talk about the joy of writing, it is absolutely Ray Bradbury with Zen and the Art of Writing. So those are some of the craft books that I might turn to when I'm lacking inspiration. But it's also okay if you are just feeling uninspired. I mean, we're allowed to have different moods. It's okay. So on those days when I am feeling as though I want to achieve something, I don't want to just throw in the towel for the day and do something else like, I don't know, regrout the bathroom or something. On those days when I still want to do something that is connected to my creativity and that's connected to my story and my writing, then I will do something that is writing adjacent. So what I mean by that is I might spend some time researching an aspect of the novel. Right now I'm working on a manuscript that requires a lot of historical research, so it's very easy for me to go down a research rabbit hole on those days when I want to feel connected to the story. Or I might do some reflective writing. How is the story going at the moment? Am I happy with the character development? Does there feel like there's enough plot? Is there too much plot? Am I going too quickly through all of my themes? Am I allowing enough time to breathe between all of these events? So I might do some reflective writing on the actual book, or I might do some reflective writing on my writing craft. Am I challenging myself enough? Am I getting enough writing done every single week? Am I happy with the writing projects I've committed to? Am I happy with my writing routine? Is it working for me? Are there things that I want to change? Are there things that I need to shake up and do differently? These writing adjacent practices can still make you feel connected to the book, to your story, to your practice, even on days when maybe you don't have the energy or the time to actually sit down and do some writing. All right, the next question is, how do you write interesting characters? So E.M. Forrester used to talk about the idea of flat characters versus round characters. Now, when you're writing a novel, not every character is going to be a round character. Some characters will be flat because they're just not that important. Maybe they're side characters or we're spending very little time with them. But when you're creating your characters, you need to think about whether they are flat or round. So flat characters tend to be characters that represent a very single idea. They often are stereotypical, they are sort of one note, and they don't change over time. How they are in the beginning is exactly how they are at the end. They're very stagnant. Whereas round characters are characters that are more complex. They're surprising. They do things that maybe you hadn't expected. They tend to have a lot more, they tend to be a lot more dynamic, they have a lot more going on, and they change over time. So how you go about creating an interesting character is aiming to have a character that is more complex. There's a lot of advice around characterization in terms of making your characters consistent. And you do want your characters to be relatively consistent and to have that continuity within their personality so that you feel as though you do know who they are. You have a sense of their personality and their behavior and their motivations. But the reality is, real people are walking contradictions. So it can be really good to include some kind of contradiction within your character or to see contradictions within their nature, because this is going to give them the flavor of believability. When you're creating particular scenes, it's also very useful to think about where is the friction in this scene going to be coming from, and very often it's going to be coming from two different characters. It's very boring to write a scene where the characters are getting along and everyone's very agreeable. It's a lot more interesting to read a scene where people are disagreeing or there's more nuance at play in their conversation. So when you're creating your characters, you want to create characters that are somewhat in opposition to each other. They don't need to be complete opposites, but they need to have different opinions so that then you're going to have this friction when you're writing your scenes. If you find that across your cast of characters, everyone is more or less the same and they're feeling kind of interchangeable and pretty generic, then you may need to ask yourself whether you need to actively construct your characters. So the author Diana Gabaldon often talks about, for her, how some characters just show up on the page. They are fully formed, they are themselves from the beginning, and there's very little active construction on her part to make the character. The character just shows up and she knows who they are from the beginning. Whereas other characters are more like onions, where she has to actively build them up. She has to introduce this character into the story for certain things to happen, but she doesn't really know who they are yet. There are these onions with multiple layers, and she has to actually build those layers very intentionally. So you might have that kind of experience when you're doing your own writing, where some characters just show up. They're round, they're complex, you know who they are, and other characters are a little bit more bland and maybe a little less memorable. If this happens, you might find that you need to actively construct those characters. And I know this can feel really formulaic and stilted and a bit like this is how you write a book, but doing a constructed character profile can help you at least get some clarity around the character. And then you can use this when you're writing your scenes. So you might like to look at their background, so what happened to them in their childhood or their early adulthood, and how has that shaped them as a person? What is their role in their social network? So not their role in the story, not are they the protagonist, the antagonist, the side character, whatever. What is their social role within their circle? Are they a counselor? Are they a leader? Are they a protector? That sort of thing. Then you're going to be thinking about their weaknesses and their strengths. And presumably this is going to be connected to both their role in their social network and their backstory. And then the two other final things that are fun to do with a character profile is to give your character some kind of secret. Now, maybe this is revealed in the course of the narrative, maybe it's not. Maybe it's actually not important to the main plot. But if you give this character a secret, that can give them a certain flavor, or it can tinge their motivation depending on what that secret is. When it comes to character description, of course, you can mention things like age and their physical appearance, their build, but it's also worthwhile to go beyond the basic. So rather than just describing your character as having brown hair and brown eyes, really think about what's going to make this character a little bit more unique. Like if you describe a character who walks in and they have brown hair and brown eyes, I mean, that's not really much of anything, is it? But if you describe a character as walking in with a leather jacket and the collar is upturned and they've got silver rings on every single finger, you're going to know so much more about that character from that description than from knowing their hair and eye color. So this is such a great question. How do you make sure you don't waffle on and write down a bunch of things that don't actually matter? So how you're going to do that is you're going to figure out what this story is actually about. So you can answer this question in a number of ways. What is your theme? What is this book trying to say? Or what is this book actually about? Fundamentally, what is it about? Is it a found family story? Is it a coming of age story? So you can think about it in terms of those sort of tropes, or you can think about it in terms of what is the underlying message? What is the theme? What is this book trying to say? So this is going to depend hugely on who you are writing for. If you're writing for a younger audience, so middle grade or YA, it is very likely there is going to be some kind of statement that your book is making. Same thing with literary fiction. But if you're writing genre fiction, it might be more about the tropes and the theme might be gentler. Of course, there's no one way to write, and we can use any combination of these approaches. But when you answer these two questions, you can use that as a guide when you're assessing your completed manuscript. So, are there any events? Are there any elements of plot that don't align or support the big overall tropes that you are using? So, like hero's journey, chosen one, found family, whatever. So, what isn't supporting those tropes? Take them out. And then, if you have a theme or a message, think about anything in the book that isn't in support of that theme or message, and then take that out. Because when you remove all of this kind of like hollow filler, then you're only going to have things left in the manuscript that are actually supporting the most important elements of that manuscript. By cutting out all of this filler, you're of course going to be reducing your word count and then making your manuscript a lot snappier and a lot more pacey. And overall, the work will feel a lot more focused. Oh, one more thing that I'll actually say about characters too is if you find that you have a number of flat characters, then you might need to consider whether or not those characters need to be collapsed. So rather than having like 4 or 5 kind of bland characters, is there a way where you can collapse a couple of them together, or maybe even all of them? Can you spell ostrich? Yes, but moustache gets me every single time. How do you know whether to write a story in first person or in third person? So this is kind of an interesting question. The issue with maybe giving advice on this is that you are probably going to have to sink some time into experimenting with the story to see which point of view works best. So which point of view feels the most organic, the most natural for this story, and which point of view do you feel like you can execute the best? So do you have the skill set to write first person really well? Do you have the skill set to write third person omniscient or third person limited or unlimited really well? So the thing you have to think about with whatever point of view you use, there are going to be strengths and limitations to that. If you're using first person, the voice is going to instantly feel very personal. The reader is going to connect with the character so much quicker because they're actively telling their story to the reader. Sometimes the problem with first person is that it can feel kind of bland and like it doesn't have that much of a voice if you don't do enough character development. The other thing you need to think about is the limitations of that character's knowledge. They don't know all the other stuff that is happening in the story. They are only privy to their information and to what is available to them. You can't just conveniently give them information or knowledge without providing a believable explanation. So you need to really think about the limitations of their knowledge within the greater story. Interestingly enough, it can be easier to write a voicey novel using third person, either omniscient, unlimited, or limited. It can be easier to kind of experiment with voice and style to a degree. There's going to be a barrier. There's going to be more of a barrier between the reader and the character. So you need to think about how you're going to bridge that barrier. And now that we have greater access to the grander story, and maybe we can move forward and backward in time a lot easier, you need to think about how you're going to withhold information from the reader. So how are we not going to give away the plot before it is time to do so? So you need to think about those limitations as well with point of view. In all likelihood, there is probably a point of view that you can execute better than the other. So you might need to have a play around with that by doing little mini scenes within your novel. So try writing a scene in first person, then flip it and write it in third person, and see how tonally that shifts the piece. It'll probably be pretty significant. So you'll need to make a decision around which one sounds right and which one feels right. And then you just need to commit to it. And you might realize later on that you made a mistake, and this does happen, and it's devastating, and it's a lot of work to fix. But sometimes this also happens, and you can't always prevent these changes when you're working on a manuscript. You can try and work things out in advance, but sometimes those insights just don't come until you're knee deep into a manuscript. So this is sort of similar to that other question before about how do you stop yourself from including everything? How do you not go off on tangents? And this question was, how do you keep to a word limit? And one of the best ways you can do this is by writing really concise and tight sentences. So really think about when you're editing your work at the sentence level, how can you tighten things up? Where are you maybe getting a bit flabby with your sentences and including information that doesn't really need to be there? The sentences are overly wordy, and I don't mean purple prose, I just mean any kind of sentence where you have just constructed it in a way that is a little bit convoluted and you've just included so many words that you didn't need to. So here is an example. So let's say we take this sentence, and this is the convoluted sentence. There, in the window on a sunny afternoon, Lucas propped himself on the ledge to watch as office workers left and went on their afternoon commutes home. Okay, so that's, you get imagery, so that's nice. There's a certain rhythm to it, but we can take that same sentence, which is 4, 5, 19, 20, 24. So we can take that sentence, which is 24 words, and we can change it to 11 words. Lucas sat on the windowsill, watching his co-workers drive by. So can you see how it's still imagery? We can see Lucas sitting on the windowsill, but it's so much snappier. And this is clearly not a very significant sentence. This is a sentence that is just moving us from A to B so that we can get on with the rest of the story. So we really don't need all those extra words that are kind of telling us nothing. This is a really great question. How do I really make my sentences pop? How do I write in a more distinctive way, such as word choice and placement of them? So what I would say here is that I wouldn't really worry about this sort of polishing, this sort of very fine-tuned sentence level editing until you are really far down the track with your manuscript. I wouldn't worry about writing beautiful sentences during your first, second, or third draft. I would only worry about that once you've actually gotten the structure of your story together. Everything is in the right place. You're really happy with your characters. You're really happy with your plot. The story is hanging well together. Then you're going to go in and worry about things on the sentence level. And there's a number of ways in which you can do this. I think the most important is that you be an active reader and that you read widely and that you read well. And I will talk more about this in another future question. And then the other thing is, I feel like maybe there's a bit of nervousness in this question around vocabulary. And something that you can do if you really want to increase your vocabulary is to start creating your own dictionary. So when you're reading a book, highlight any word that you don't know, and of course you're going to look up the word, but then also record that word in a notebook along with the meaning. And then every week, every time you sit down to do a writing session, really challenge yourself to go through your self-created dictionary and try and see or look for opportunities where you can insert these new words that you have discovered. So you can build these into the manuscript you're actively working on, or you might like to use these as like a writing activity or a writing prompt, maybe as a little warm-up before you get into your writing session. Again, there's no rules around how you can do this stuff or how you can implement these things, but that could be a nice way to get yourself used to using different words and really learning how to use that word correctly given its meaning, by maybe doing a warm-up exercise where you write a few sentences where you are using that word in a sentence in support of a little scene that you've constructed, or you can try and build it into your actual manuscript that you're working on that day. What is a good way to add more detail and make the story more interesting and believable? Okay, so I'm going to talk about a concept that I absolutely did not make up, but I heard it from Mary Robinette Cowell, where she did a short story lecture for Brandon Sanderson as part of his YouTube series. at Brown University. So I'll include a link in the description box below so you can watch the entire video. But Mary talks about the MICE structure in terms of storytelling. So MICE. And she talks about these 4 different story structures that we use when we're telling a story. So milieu is M, and that's when a character is entering a new space, they encounter obstacles, and then they leave that space. And presumably they have survived this particular setting. So these are setting stories. An example might be The Hunger Games, where Katniss is obviously then having to survive the games because this is a life-threatening setting that she has entered into. I is inquiry. So this is when a character has a question that they're trying to answer. The story begins with a question. The obstacles are them trying to find the answer, and then they can't until eventually they do. And that's when we have the story resolve. So a really good example of this are mystery novels or crime novels. So whodunit novels or why did they do it novels. C would be for character. So these are character-led stories. So it usually begins with the character wanting to change some element of themselves. Then they're trying to do this throughout the middle of the story, but there's obstacles. They are really struggling to change themselves, and with this self-growth, this transformation and development, but eventually they do succeed, and then that's when the story resolves. The final one, E, is for event. So this is external events. So something happens that interrupts the status quo. The character is then trying to fix this situation, but of course they can't because then the story would be over. But then eventually they do succeed and we reach a new status quo and we are in a state of peace again. So these events could be anything from like Armageddon stories, meteorites hitting the earth, huge explosions, that kind of thing. So when you're trying to think about how can I make a story more interesting, ask which of these categories your story is maybe falling into. Now, the thing is, most stories will not just be one of these particular structures, M-I-C-E. It should be multiple structures, or it should be all 4 structures. All 4 of these should be in your story to some degree in some way. There might be an overarching one, but then the other 3 should also exist within the piece. If you were to write a story that was just an event story, and we had no character transformation, there were no questions, and there was no sense of this environment being maybe dangerous, or we're entering a new place, we're in a new space. If we didn't have those other 3 things, then this story would be probably kind of boring. So if you feel as though your story is a little bit flat, potentially this could be the reason why. Maybe there just isn't actually enough stuff going on in your story. So think about where the milieu is happening in your story, where the inquiry, the character, and the events are happening. Is there an overarching one? Do you need to build in more of the other ones? And that sort of stuff. Where do you find your inspiration? Where do I find my inspiration? Inspiration is like super overrated. I actually just wouldn't even really worry about being inspired. Inspiration is hard to come by and short-lived. I think, and Octavia Butler says this the best. I just had to look up this quote so that I could say it exactly. First, forget inspiration. Habit is more dependable. Habit will sustain you whether you're inspired or not. Habit will help you finish and polish your stories. I think we really give way too much credit and praise to inspiration. I think there can be a tendency with writing to think that writing is always fun and that it's always easy and that it's never work. And the reality is sometimes it is work. So there's things you can do to make you feel inspired if that is what you really want on that particular day in order to get yourself in the chair in front of the blank page and writing. But the reality is it's actually a lot easier to just develop a writing habit. So think about how you can make writing a more regular part of your everyday life. And when I say everyday life, I don't mean you have to write every day, but I do think there is a tremendous value in writing consistently. So maybe you write every second day. Maybe you book into your calendar, your weekly calendar, 4 writing sessions every single week. So you are regularly touching base with your story and you are really committed to your writing. You've put time aside for it and you are making it happen. Now, this doesn't need to be like 4 hours. It can be 25 minutes. It can be 15 minutes. But you've committed to putting that time aside to do your writing practice or to work on your manuscript. So don't worry about inspiration. It's too hard to make it happen, but habits and scheduling and booking things in, that you can do. And I guarantee people who build a writing habit are way more likely to have a finished manuscript than people who only write when they're inspired. Okay, this is very connected to my last comment, so I wanted to share this too. How do you not lose interest in some stories you may write? Okay, so there is actually a level of commitment that you need to have when you're a writer. It can be really easy to want to give up on a manuscript when it's gotten hard and to then follow the exciting, new, inspiring idea that is the shiny silver ball. But the thing is, I promise you, that ball is all shiny and silver now, but once you start working on that book, that new story, it will also become work at some point. I don't think enough authors maybe talk about this, where we think that stories have to be like really high and really exciting and really inspiring all the time, every time you sit down to write, or you're in this like dark, tortured artist, emotional, like I have to cut open my vein and bleed onto the page kind of like mentality. So we're either like the tortured artist or we're like super inspired and with the muse. So we have these like two like polar opposite energy points that we think people are in when we're writing. But the reality is like you're going to have ups and downs with your writing, and very often it might be actually fairly neutral where you're not like super inspired or super low. You're just doing the work, and like it is fun and hard. It is inspiring and grueling. Like it is both of these things at the same time, or there's up and downs, but it's not always this stagnant one sort of like emotional state. That how you feel with your writing and how writing makes you feel is going to probably change from day to day. And this is why it really requires this level of commitment to a story. I think that there will be times when you're working on a manuscript and the story just does feel dead and you just can't breathe any life into it. And then you do need to make the decision of whether or not you want to give up on this project. But I think you need to really be honest with yourself and really reflect on, is this project actually dead and I can't make myself excited about this anymore? Or am I just maybe, or do I just have a bit of like shiny silver ball syndrome and I actually just really need to commit to this project and see it through to the end and just park that new inspired idea until it's time in the queue for me to approach that project. So I went to Iris Van Harpen's exhibition at Goma very recently, and Iris is a fashion designer. She is a fashion designer, but when you look at her clothes, they're borderline sculptures. Like these are very meticulously made dresses, and they're more than just dresses. They really are works of art within themselves. And when I was going around this exhibition, I was constantly amazed by the commitment that has been made to each one of these garments. So some of these dresses / sculptures had like 960 hours of work put into them. Now, some of them had been laser cut with like 3D printers. Can you laser cut with 3D printers? I don't freaking know. I'm not a technology person. But some of the dresses were made with technology. But then some of the dresses were handmade where Iris and her team were cutting out the material with scissors and doing these really meticulous little pieces to make up a full dress.
Okay, editing Tara jumping in here right now. So I fully recognize that if you were making garments, you're probably cutting material with scissors. But what I was getting at there was that there was a level of monotony and attention to detail and a great deal of care that then was going into making these garments, and that performing those particular actions would have been really boring and I mean not really exciting, and the artists remained committed to their vision anyway.
And I just sat there while I was watching the video at the end of this exhibition thinking, that is the commitment you need to your art, because sometimes making art is not super inspiring or fun or lighthearted. Sometimes it's actually just really boring, meticulous work. But you are sitting in that bored, meticulous work because you have a greater vision for the bigger piece of art. This is a tiny stage that is going to support you in making that final product, if we want to use that word, that final piece of art. So I think that there is this need to just really be committed to your craft, even when it doesn't feel all juicy and inspiring, even when you lose interest, as this writer has said in their question. Even when you have lost interest in your art, how can you stay committed to it because you have a grander vision that you're trying to accomplish? This is a great question. When you're writing a chapter, should it have the same structure as a whole story, like a small story inside a bigger story? So pretty recently, I put up a video called How to Actually Write a Scene. So you may find it valuable to go back and watch that video. But in the comments of that video, someone actually said this exact same thing about writing a chapter that has its own sort of story arc. So you have a beginning, an escalating action, sort of like a climax within that chapter, and then you have a denouement. Now, obviously, you wouldn't use this exact structure for every single chapter, but if you're finding it difficult to write a chapter or to conceive of what should be involved within a chapter, then this might be a really easy way to frame that. Like I said, you're not going to use this every time because some chapters are going to have more of a cliffhanger ending because you're trying to hook the reader into the next chapter, whereas other chapters will have more of a satisfying resolution to them because the reality is it can feel a bit gimmicky to have a chapter end always on a hook, and people are going to have to put the book down at some stage. So it can be nice to give your reader a little rest and to have those senses of resolution throughout the story on that chapter level. But this can be a really good way to think about it. What is our establishing shot? Where are we? Who are we with? What is happening? And then setting the reader down, like grounding the reader in time and place and in action, and then allowing that to escalate as it needs to, depending on your overall outline for the story. So that is a really good way to approach it. But it's not the only way. Okay, this is maybe one of my favorite questions, and I'm probably going to get a little bit into the weeds with this one. So someone asked, how do you become a better writer before you become an author? And how you become a better writer is by reading and by writing. So read a lot, read often. I often have students ask me, if I want to be a writer, do I always need to be a reader? And the answer is absolutely yes. Reading is the only apprenticeship that a writer has to undertake. You need to read so that you understand what is happening at the story level, what is happening at the sentence level when you're creating a narrative. If you're just reading all the time, in your subconscious, you will get an intuitive ear for what story sounds like, what story should look like. But I also recommend being an active reader in that you annotate all of the books that you are reading. Wow, I am really not good at this. So annotate the books that you are reading. Make up a little key at the start of your book. So this color is going to be for quote, this one for character, plot, and theme. And then as you're reading, you're going to annotate your book like this. And when you're reading your books, don't be afraid to grab a pencil or pen and to underline sentences that you love, or to circle particular words that really stand out and you can see that the author has used that particular word for a very particular effect and to communicate something very precise. Write questions in the margins. Write questions as the reader. Write comments as a writer. Like, this is really great characterization, or why did that happen? Is this going to come up again? Is this a clue? When you're an active reader, you are really participating in the telling of that story, and you are also going to be a lot more aware of what is happening as you're reading, because you're going to be actively constructing and engaging with the story on that level, rather than more passively sort of consuming it. And now the next thing I recommend is to keep a book journal. So you can make this as elaborate or as simple as you like. But for myself, and I know I've done videos on this in the past, for myself, I tend to write down some pretty basic facts about the book, like obviously title and author, but what year it was published, what format I read it in. Then I usually write a summary of the plot. I write down what themes I think are being explored in the book. Then I do maybe like a character breakdown. I write some of my favorite quotes from the book, and then I might do a page where I'm talking about like my overall thoughts of the book. And then one of my favorite things to do is to write 5 things I would steal from the book in terms of techniques or structure or elements in the story that I really enjoyed. So this way I'm like being a really active reader, but I'm also approaching it from a writing standpoint, where I'm actively constructing the story and thinking about how that writer has actually put it together and the sort of literary techniques that they have used. So if you want to be a better writer, you have to be a really good reader. And then the only other thing you have to do, is to have a reasonably active writing practice. So this kind of harkens back to what I said before. You either need to be working on a larger manuscript or have an active writing practice where you're practicing the act of writing, even if you're not working on one singular project, or you can do both. But you do have to be writing. You have to be writing all the time. And you have to give yourself permission to not be great, because maybe you're learning. But by doing this writing all the time, you will absolutely get better. And there's no shortcuts around this stuff. There's no secret. You just need to keep participating in your own creative craft. Okay, there are actually heaps more questions, but I've talked too much already, and this is probably going to be a ridiculously long video. So I might save the rest of those questions and do like another video like this. If you like the format of this video, let me know. You can give it a thumbs up or write a comment. And I know that sounds like such a YouTubey gimmick of like, do this stuff so that then the video gets more views. But I would like to actually know, is this an interesting format for a video, or is it horrendously boring? You can let me know that too. Or not. If nobody watches the video, I'll get the hint pretty quick. Either way, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate your time. I hope that you know that. If you would like to watch any more videos by myself, there's a slew of videos on the channel, or you can go to taraeast.com and dive into the archives. If you're there, I invite you to join my email newsletter. When you do, you'll receive a newsletter whenever I write them, which is pretty random. And they'll include a note by me, some resources I've recently loved and think you will too, as well as some tidbits that I only share via email. Now go do some writing, because the world actually does need more books.